very comfortable.
There's one way to find out.
Oh, that's nice.
It probably beats standing for half an hour. All right, so we have approximately 30 minutes to address the ethical implications of everything that's been introduced over the past 2 days.
Fortunately, it's a really easy problem.
Yeah, no problem, right? I also want to, again, encourage you all to take some agency in this conversation as well. I will be checking, after we've queued up some themes and put some conversational fodder on the table, I'll be checking the app to see what questions you all would like to address to Vivienne and Divya, so please get those into us. But to kick off, I'd like to return to something that Vivienne said this morning, where in your session you mentioned watching some of your past work, and I think this was maybe on algorithms or effective computing or emotion analytics, that you now have seen that work make its way out into the world and maybe be put to ends that you had not intended. How did the two of you in your respective careers and in your research think about ethics? And also, how has that thinking changed over time, if it has?
Well, so I get asked to give a lot of talks on what's called AI for good. And the truth is, AI for good is really straightforward. It's the same thing as like hammers for good. Do good things with it. You know, I think we all have some check in ourselves about what's good. I would say it's AI not for bad that's the hard part. It's the things that we do in our daily lives, in our companies, where we're not really certain what the consequences will be. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I mean, it certainly seemed like a good idea to be able to build these systems that, for example, we were able to use for autistic kids to help them learn how to read facial expressions. But to know that similar things are being used in countries for authoritarian purposes is a real gut check. It was never intended, but of course it's an obvious consequence of the work in retrospect. I think we need to be better at this. We should never be able to get away with how could we have known. Of course we could have known, how we chose to think hard about it. And it's exactly in those hard decisions where there is good to be done and there's bad that could be done where the actual grist of this whole discussion really takes place.
Divya, how about you? I know you've spent a lot of your career at research institutions and also within, I would assume, a more regulated and heavily guidelined environment. How do you think about ethics in your research, and how has that evolved?
So right now at Stanford, I'm actually building a database which involves me collecting the brain signals of my patients and actually comparing that data set to their genetic data. So we're biobanking these patients at the same time. Now, I have every confidence that as best as can be managed, Stanford puts the genetic data behind a good double firewall. That's really hard to access. But the data I've collected, it turns out it has a lot of commercialization potential. We could be looking at it for biomarkers to actually help people who have disorders of consciousness and all sorts of other things. So then what came up with me as I evolved from being just an academic to moving into an entrepreneurial space is I'd like to build out this database, but I am now terrified of the consequences of banking people's brain signals. And part of the reason is that it turns out there's a study that was done, for instance, if you actually train an algorithm on a database of alcoholics and non-alcoholics, the algorithm gets actually pretty good at detecting which brain signals belong to alcoholics. Now, if you were to take these trained algorithms, see, that's the training set, and then run them on my data, you might be able to pick out people with alcoholism, other kinds of mental diseases, things that you could use against them. I don't ever want to know that something I built was commercialized to be used against someone. That was never my intent. And so now I'm trying to understand how do you navigate forward and not thwart the research that will do good in the world. Mining for biomarkers, learning about brains to be used against people.
And it's enormously challenging. I mean, what you're saying immediately evokes a couple of things in me. I mentioned earlier in the keynote that we had built a system to predict manic episodes in bipolar sufferers. Well, the actual company that we were working with was actually doing market research. So I was just using the data for this philanthropic purpose. But we were able to run it over anonymized data out of that big market research database, you know, tens, hundreds of thousands of people. And we could clearly see individuals, very likely some of them undiagnosed, experiencing manic episodes. And we couldn't do anything about it because none of them had opted in to doing this. And you know, I also shared the story earlier of my son's diabetes. In the months leading up to his diagnosis, I was on Google regularly searching about bedwetting. Now, in retrospect, bedwetting is a very common symptom in childhood pediatric type 1 diabetes, just the way the body gets rid of the extra sugar. But I will say this, as someone that now builds algorithms like this, Google knew. Now, I'm not literally saying anyone inside Google knew my son had diabetes, or even they were running the algorithms. But I do know, from having collaborated with Google and other groups in the past, they made an explicit decision not to do that. And they did it specifically because of these issues. And what I want to say in confronting issues of ethics is that's an ethical choice too. Almost certainly, someone died because of that decision. I don't mean to lay that at the feet of the executives that were involved, but you have to understand, saying, oh gosh, this is very complicated and we don't want to get involved, is exactly the same thing as saying no. And if you could have made a difference and you didn't, that has to strongly get weighed against how it could be misused. I do want to also throw out because there's such a parallel to your story, I'm not going to name the school or the company because I don't want to get any details wrong, but a very prominent recent story about a startup that was leveraging a bunch of pathology data, and it uncovered two big ethical issues. One, well, several. The patients weren't volunteering, nor were the pathologists whose expertise in analyzing that data was being leveraged to train the AIs. And on the other side, turned out a bunch of board members of the hospitals were investors in that startup and were financially benefiting from its success. Now, they may genuinely have believed they were doing good in the world, but separating out their self-interest from the greater good is basically impossible. And it immediately sets up a situation where you're virtually guaranteed to make a mistake.
Since you all have gone ahead and kind of delved in already to your story about working on an AI for your son's diabetes, and Divya, you talked this morning a lot about medical wearables, and we covered a little bit of new brain interfaces. What do you all see as the future of biometric and neurocognitive data privacy? And how should we think about responsible data stewardship in this new era? I mean, I feel like this is maybe something that at the human scale of everyone in this room, we're going to have choices to make. So what does that future look like?
All right, so if you're going to put an implant in your brain, that implant can be hacked. Let's just put that out there, put it on the table. It's a known.
So cancel your plans for the afternoon to put that implant in your brain. Hold off.
But many of you might not realize that, you know, all the IoT devices you put in your home have an equal risk of being hacked. So you could be spied on, people could be filming you, collecting your data, figuring out when you come and go, etc. Putting that aside, neural interfaces are going to absolutely change the landscape of human disease, and they will probably also be used very, very soon for human augmentation. So the question becomes now, how do you actually safeguard that data, and who owns that data? Suppose you put in a device into your brain that Medtronic owns. Do they own your brain signals? Do they somehow get to bank them and profit off them? Do they get to, you know, generate hypotheses, test them, and then sell you? Do they get to advertise directly to you? Can those implants be used in the opposite direction? You can actually, anything you can read from, there's a good chance you can actually manipulate it and use it as an actuator. So is mind control a possibility? I don't have a good answer for this. Like all technology, in some sense, this train has left the station, and in a way, it needs to happen. We're curing human disease. So we need to start having collective conversations. Every single one of you needs to know this is no longer science fiction, And you need to start asking yourselves, where are the lines that you draw in the sand so we can all have these conversations on a global level, horizontally, but also through so many different verticals. So I'm going to start there.
I think that's a good place. And Vivienne, we've talked a little bit.
I wonder how many people here can remember getting their brain implant in during lunch? Good, so they're already working.
Worked perfectly.
So I just want to echo, but somewhat more provocatively, what she's saying. Over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to fundamentally change the definition of what it means to be human. Just focus on one area where I do work, working memory span. So we have a startup right now which is a non-invasive technology. It's just a wearable headband, leverages not all that exciting, something called alternating current transcranial stimulation. So it reads out signals from your brain in more posterior regions, and then it synchronizes, or what's called increases the coupling between gamma rhythms in your frontal lobes and theta rhythms more posteriorly. And it turns out, you'd asked me 10 years ago whether this would have made you smarter, and I'd have said, bullshit. But it does. It does in very measurable ways. And amazingly enough, you know, the two groups that are funding this the most are DARPA, so the American Defense Advanced Research Projects. So they want to make powered soldiers. And the computer e-gaming industry, where if you think people pay a lot for football and basketball, whoa, the kind of pots that are building up in the professional computer gaming industry are so big that they're willing to stick these things on their heads to just get a tiny advantage over their competitors. And these early versions should not be used, certainly not for extended periods of time. We have no idea what they would do to people long term. But, so this current version that we developed, flip a switch, 15% increase in working memory span. So that might translate into as much as a 15 to 30% increase in lifetime earnings. Now, if you knew that the family down the street was getting this for their child, forget the health consequences. If you knew they were getting it for their kids, wouldn't you at least have to start thinking, well, how are my kids ever going to get into university if they don't have one also? And this is a very small improvement. On my website, it has said, literally, for 20 years, what if it was 20 plus or minus 2? So this is a reference to a very famous old 1950s psychology paper, perhaps one of the most famous, the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, and it's some of the original work on working memory span. So if the average person's 7, and if you're 9 or 10, you have a huge advantage in life. If you're in the low teens, you are abnormal. You are amongst the rarest individuals people will meet. If you're 20, you're off the charts. So in a world in which people might be 20s and the rest of us are still puttering around in the single digits, you don't even have to envision them being malicious. They would look at the rest of us like we have Down syndrome. You would have a split between what it means to be a traditional human and the new kind, and it would be unrecoverable. And this sounds like science fiction. I know it sounds like science fiction, and the specifics are. The specifics are made up. But the details, the technologies that exist that could make this change as we figure it out over the next 10 years, they exist. And this is a reality. I don't know when we will ever have artificial intelligence that are smarter than people, but I can give you a rough timeline when there are people that are artificially smarter than others. And I will finish by saying, in reference to what you were saying earlier, who owns the data coming out of your brain in these systems? This is another huge issue. I talked about hacking the devices on my son. The reason I had to hack them wasn't because, I mean, the cover story is it makes them secure against people hacking medical devices, which is genuine good. But it also means they get to sell you back the very data that's coming out of your sick child's body. You believe that they won't try and sell you back your own dreams? Of course they will. They'll sell it back to you in advertising. And neuroadvertising is a very real thing in the world already.
By the way, you can already reconstruct dreams in the visual space.
Yes.
You can mind read and reconstruct dreams. And you had been asking about the ethics, actually, of how things have changed. I have turned down so many jobs and consulting opportunities for companies that are specifically looking for neuroadvertising. And I say, look, advertising lights up the same parts of your brain as cocaine. I'm not particularly in the business of helping you enhance addiction. That's just not what I was put on this earth for. And so I turned down really lucrative opportunities. It doesn't feel right. So that goes along with this entire ethics. I'm sure this is spinning off a whole bunch of other questions for you.
No, yeah, this is fantastic. So, I mean, everything that you two are saying here this afternoon, and then also a lot of what you introduced this morning suggests that, as Divya said a moment ago, maybe the train has already left the station, right? And so now, if all indicators suggest that the next thing that we are learning to program and to hack is the human, we're at a remarkable moment and a very fraught moment in the history of life. And where are the lines drawn today? Do lines exist? I mean, clearly you all have personal lines, but at the collective level, at the societal level, where are those lines and who draws them?
There are no lines, because what happens is the train leaves before you even think to draw them. It's like a frog being slowly boiled in hot water. You don't even know it's happening until it's happened. I think we had been talking in the break room. It is somewhat of a space race. So imagine this. She's saying people down the street have a device that can make their kid a little bit smarter than yours, and now they can recall 20 digits, and your kid only recalls 7. What happens when the US and the EU and the Chinese government get into that kind of race? Let's say everybody agrees that maybe we shouldn't use gene editing to edit the germline. And somebody says, yeah, but we could produce a next generation of Chinese kids that's 20% smarter than those American kids, those Brazilian kids, those Portuguese kids. Why wouldn't they do that? And so you're going to create conflicts of interest. You're also going to create a black market. So whatever you say is the standard. People sell their organs for money. People do all sorts of things when things are outlawed or banned. What makes you think people aren't going to be editing genomes on a black market? I mean, you could buy a CRISPR kit and use it in your garage if you want to, right? So this is not going to be difficult to do. And another unintended consequence of this, by the way, is altering our entire biome. Let's say you decide you want to alter this bug over here because you're a curious kind of kid. What happens when that bug gets out into the environment and starts to destroy everything else around it? What have you actually done to alter the biome? All of this is now. None of this is the future. These are all questions we need to answer now. So I don't even know where to keep going with this question. This is a big deal.
It is a big deal. And I think that we've seen evidence of where this happens before, because it's not the case that we've never had experiences like this. Just look at the way the internet developed. Essentially, it was a first mover principle. And those companies that got out there first and built the most robust organizations that were able to extract the most information for the least cost. When you look at each of these, one after another, and I'm not saying they aren't amazing organizations or we don't beloved their products, but none of the big tech companies were actually the inventors of the amazing transformation that came to our lives. Google didn't invent search, although they made it much better. Microsoft didn't invent the personal operating system, and Facebook didn't invent social networks. What they figured out is how to monetize them better than anyone else could. And they got to decide what the rules of the game were, how data got used, how people interacted with these systems, because they were able to push out into these green fields no one had ever been in before. And as business people, that sounds great. Reset the system, tear it all down, start from the beginning. But what it means is there's no norms. There's nothing there. It's Lord of the Flies. You show up on a deserted island with no one to tell you what is going to bring it all down. And we built systems which turns out, in many cases, to be fundamentally unstable. So now we're looking at augmenting ourselves with direct neural technologies, using augmentative intelligence, which is AI that makes us smarter and better. And it's unambiguous that we can do it. One of the most robust uses for machine learning is to change how we think. It is going to be used by every government. It is going to be used in advertising, every company. And while I don't need to name the name, I have gotten some very fancy-smancy chief scientist job offers from a lot of very big companies. And one of the themes that has come up and was explicit in one of the jobs is we have a whole bunch of workers that work here, and they largely move boxes around. We don't like unions, and we don't like workmen's compensation lawsuits. So your job will be to make them want to leave after 2 years. And yes, I can do that. So what does it mean to make your own independent decisions in the world when there is some villain like me that will help make them for you? And I'm not even getting inside their heads. So these are incredibly powerful things. And I'm not saying anyone at those companies were bad people, but they were acting in their interest. And if we don't have the same sort of power, if we don't have the ability to actually enforce our own right to agency and self-determination, someone else will do it for us. There is no right that you can't enforce.
How many of you actually keep downloading apps on your phones that are free, that right before you install them, they say, you know, the flashlight needs access to your address book, to your camera, to your this and that, and you just said, oh yeah, okay, yes, 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 it's supposed to be a really good flashlight. How many of you do that? Yeah. So you just sold your soul for a flashlight that probably could have cost you, you know, €1.99 or something. Don't do that. Do not sell your data for nothing. There is nothing free in this world. So when anybody gives you something free, almost always they want something for it. And right now what they want is you, and that is your most precious asset. So stop giving it to them.
So I want to turn back a little bit to something that you all have raised already. If there's no
uncomfortable
but there is a bottle of water for you.
Yeah, I can sit on that.
That's the best I can do right now. If there's not a governing body that we can look to regulate these things meaningfully at the societal level, and we don't trust the markets necessarily to drive towards human-centered outcomes, is there a possibility for some kind of other agency, some self-organization among the people involved? We have seen, I think, both around germline editing and also the development of lethal autonomous weapons, we have seen recently some pledges where researchers have come out and said, no, collectively, we are not going to do this. Is that a viable path, or is that not going to be enough?
I just want to interject in all of this. We do this work. We're not Luddites. So we're not here to just say all of this is evil, and the answer to it is no. But it is irrational for us to make this decision, or for industrialists to make this decision, or central party leaders. That's why we're here talking, because there are amazing uses of these technologies. We're not spending our time talking about it here, but hopefully if you saw some of our talks earlier, you got that side of it as well. But the reason we're talking is because we shouldn't be deciding. We should be deciding what happens. And right now, one of the exploits here is we're able to get into the moments in our lives where we don't make good decisions, where it's very quick and it's easy and it doesn't matter that much. And it seems, how could I possibly make a difference? So what we're talking about here, to me, is a lot about the human side of this. The realities is a lot of these systems, like these pledges, all these AI researchers saying they will not build autonomous weapons. A lot of AI researchers signing pledges saying, there's a standard ethics for AI, and we will not break that. I think it's wonderful in spirit. But I need solutions that work in the real world with people making hasty decisions. If we all made perfect decisions, Coca-Cola would go out of business tomorrow. No one would be smoking. All of these things that we know are terrible for ourselves, and we do them anyways, wouldn't happen. These sorts of tough ethical choices right now still exist in the same world. And if we idealize it, if we think simply making an ethical pledge will solve the problem, then we are pretending that humans are more than they currently are. And maybe they will be. All those augmented humans 30 years from now, maybe they'll make much better decisions than we, and we should speed it up. But for now, we need solutions that actually work with real people. I'll pass it to you.
What might that look like, Divya?
Well, so I'm beginning to buy into this idea that we ought to decentralize. And if you listen to the last two speakers in this room, Alex Gladstein and Nathaniel, they both actually brought up some really interesting mechanisms by which we can actually distribute both agency, so your ability to make choices for yourself, and power and decision making. And I don't think there's quite the perfect solution in the sense that, for instance, if you create any kind of distributed technology, if you're not willing to do the work, you're going to end up trading with somebody else for your convenience, and they may end up owning you anyway. But there might be ways. For instance, if you decentralize authority, and what you make available to people is they own their data, and what you make available centrally are algorithms that they can actually take and download and shop for as they choose, so they can use their data in a way that benefits them. That might be a way to actually access a system where you can then choose, I'm going to sell this little piece of my data because I know that's going to help me. I'm going to anonymize that part of my data because that's protected for me. I would like to actually contribute some of my data to, say, that scientific research. I get to make those choices. I do not trust governments, corporations, companies to make those decisions for me at all.
So I agree with decentralization. I agree with a number of the ideas that have been put out, data ownership, rights around these sorts of things. The thing that I think needs to go along with it is people's willingness to exert those rights. As you already heard today, I've done some fairly amazing things, both with my own data and my son's data and data from LinkedIn that they didn't intend to volunteer. And it's amazing to be able to build something that truly makes a difference in people's lives. But frankly, if I do have all of my Facebook data. I got sick of using Facebook a long time ago and pulled all my data off and deleted my account. I'm not doing anything with it. I've got other things to focus on my time. I get emails from people that have dying children. What am I going to screw around with my data for? Someone else could do it and sell me the service and collect the data, and now we're back in the same loop. We create a massive distributed system. No central authority controls anything. We can share out our data, and then someone comes along and says, I got a free flashlight for you. And it'll allow you to enter into the distributed web. And you sign up for it, and now they've got all of your data, even though it's supposedly secure and distributed. So the ingredient that this needs to happen, but I think the ingredient that needs to go along with it is us. And right now, we're not that impressive in our decision-making track record. So how about this? This was a line that I actually had queued up in my talk earlier, but had to blow through the slide very quickly. And it's this idea that technology needs to challenge us. There was a study out of UC Berkeley recently in which they found that when people were on Facebook, they didn't get worked up, they didn't get angry, they actually calmed down. And that was the way they posed it. Maybe Facebook isn't so bad. So I went and looked at the data they collected. Yeah, they calmed down. They calmed way down. They turned off. People went on to Facebook, and I'm not picking on them, it should be true of anyone else. They went on there, and they started liking things and glancing at pictures. You ever seen a teenager run through Instagram? Bam, bam, bam. There's no deep processing going on there. It's stars and likes and brief interactions. And this is the way these systems are designed. Not to be bad, but of course they create this dynamic in which we don't deeply engage with the world. What if it was designed differently? What if we built a world from the architecture and social dynamics all the way through to our daily technology? And I could give you examples, but I'm sure we're going to run out of time, where it actively made us better. That was part of the design ethic. Not only did I get that task done, but I am a better person in a measurable way at the end. If we want people to make use of these incredible infrastructures we're talking about, we need to make people that will do that. And there is one thing that I think is actually within the hands of industry itself, is to stop giving us garbage and start giving us something that not only makes me better when I'm using it, It makes me better after I turn it off again as well. And there's precious few technologies that exist in the world that do that.
Actually, think about this. This also came up in the break room, but almost everybody in the world uses Google Maps or some version of this. GPS before Google Maps. When I was in college, I actually took a course on celestial navigation, and I built a sextant, and I actually mapped the sky for a month as part of my final project, and I discovered that at the latitude I was living at in Boston at the time, the angle of the moon's crescent, actually, if you were to plot that, you could actually use it to navigate your azimuth in the world. And I don't know, I'm going to guess that the part of my brain that does spatial navigation called the hippocampus probably got a little bigger that semester. And one thing that scares the bejesus out of me is that every time I use my phone to navigate in the world, I lose a little bit of my spatial perception. I don't read paper maps as often, although I do keep some in my car as a backup. And this is the kind of thing where, you know, maps makes me smarter and more efficient in the moment, but it actually makes me dumber in the long term. And how do I balance these two things? You know, back when we developed automotive technology and people stopped taking horses or walking everywhere, I mean, nobody would go back and say that that was a better life. That made us very inefficient. But obesity rates began to rise. And so maybe one of the things we need to do is actually recognize where the technology's pitfalls are and build in something to, I mean, you know, I drive a lot of places, so I have to go to the gym, right? So I compensate for it in some way. Maybe I shouldn't be using Google Maps all the time. When I have the time, I should challenge myself to rebuild my spatial network.
Here's an example. Here's a very tangible example off that specific case. So I fly into Paris. I know Paris only a tiny bit, and I hate to drive. So I get dropped off on the outskirts of town. I say to Google, you know, I'm staying at this hotel, and it gives me the direct route to get there. In fact, their current VR system, I don't know what sort of idiot would wander around holding their phone in front of you, but it gives you an AR, like augmented reality map, and it tells you literally, turn here, turn there. You just cost yourself 5 years of cognitive longevity in your life. On the other hand, imagine I fly in, I say, hey, I'm going to this hotel, and it says, okay, and I put it in my pocket, and I start wandering. Now, this is where technology can make us better. It doesn't direct me, it just monitors. And I make a wrong turn, but I'm only a block off, so it says, you know what, this is fine. She's navigating. I do not predict that this is a catastrophic failure. I built a model of her. Later, now I'm several blocks off track. Does it pop up and show me the map, tell me I'm making a mistake? Nope. I open it up, and I've got a text message from Google's assistant. It says, hey, Vivienne, where's the Eiffel Tower? Oh, oh, shit. Well, it turns out the way we learn to navigate through space, those very hippocampal maps we're talking about, are landmark-based. Now something that could have been either a terrible experience because I wandered and wandered, never found my way to the hotel, or could have cost me in the long run because I just depended on the map to get there. Now it only gave me what I needed, and it turned it into a growth experience. I took a little bit longer to get to the hotel, but I was a better person when I got there. And we could choose to design all of our products this way. And that is something that we can make an affirmative choice around.
That you all have managed to bring this all the way around to celestial navigation and exploration when we're at a summit in Portugal, I think is actually pretty perfect. And so to think about summing up here, it sounds like in addition to what I think is an excellent decision that all of you have already made to come out and to engage and to learn and to educate yourselves on the possibilities, the timelines, to understand that we're not talking about science fiction, we're talking about what is already here, and we have a pretty good idea of where some of these things will go because we've seen them go there before. That we have that responsibility to learn, to become more responsible stewards, to demand more and better from our technologies and our tools, and maybe to weigh a little bit more carefully the choice that we find between convenience and agency. Do those all sound like fair takeaways?
Yes, as I said, it's all very easy.
Which is why we only allotted 30 minutes for it. Divya, do you have anything you'd like to add as we close out?
I'm just kind of glad we're all here together. Every time I'm asked what people can do about these things, I tell them, educate yourself and have the global conversation. And I've got to echo what you're saying. There's no better thing than you guys all being here, immersed in, I mean, look, you're getting all these verticals, and they're coming at you from different direction. So each one of you, your brains are going to make different lateral connections between the things you're learning and picking up, and you're going to pick up things that none of us have ever thought about before. And you're going to take that back to your families, your communities, your political systems, whatever it is you do, and you've got to be more involved in the governance of your lives. That's what it comes down to. That agency piece of things is the biggest one.
So I want to throw out one last thing as something you suggested, and we again talked about earlier today in private, is maybe there is a role for institutions in this. Yes, these technologies move very fast, and often far too fast for a lot of traditional institutions to keep up. Laws are glacial compared to what we're talking about. GDPR is well-intentioned, but if you think it solved a problem, I hate to break it to you, but it's so easy to get around stuff like this. It's terrifying. But maybe there's an opportunity to create new institutions that can actually affirmatively go out and help create norms and reward those people that are doing right and doing good in the world. We talked earlier that it's probably not about punishment. It's not about creating this whack-a-mole with a black market, which will never be won. But if we could go to both private companies and public and NGOs and universities and create standard norms and build on them by recognizing, supporting, sharing data with people that are doing good in the world, that are actively acting in the greater community interest, you could actually potentially transform something. And I want to throw it out there as a real possibility. Is there a possibility that we could create something, and this could sound very loaded because many of you might loathe the World Bank or the World Health Organization, but rethink what we could do. What if people really loved innovation, but they could direct some of what we're about? They could find the stuff that is truly making positive difference in people's lives and make it even easier, and help to direct that flow and create some of these norms without, but by creating living organizations that could balance the power against some of these other institutions that have a vested interest in seeing some of this stuff happen in unhelpful ways. There's some great ideas to be explored here.
And I think that builds beautifully on the conversation they just had with Nathaniel Calhoun. And I think we will leave you all with the idea that it is on us, and building a better tomorrow is going to take the best from each of us. So thank you for joining us in conversation. Thank you for joining us in conversation. We're going to take a break for about 40 minutes, and I will see you all back at stage 0, the main stage in the main room, and we will close out the program with your friend David Roberts. Thank you all.